Thank you so much, Linda and Catherine. I'm thrilled to be here to talk to everybody at the Newark Museum. You really have an extraordinary Calder mobile. There are very few of these audio mobiles, these mobiles that sound as well as move. Calder was born in 1898 and died in 1976. It's a huge career, and in the brief time I have to talk to you about it, and then we'll talk a little bit more in conversation after this, I wanted to kind of zoom in on three periods, times in his life: his childhood, which is very, very important for understanding Calder, the period in the late 20s into the early 30s when he had a kind of transformative time in Paris. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about what we might call his mature work, which begins in the late 30s in the lead up to World War II. The most important thing, the first really key thing to know about Calder and understand about Calder, and I hope we have an image up here, is that he was part of he was born into a family of artists. He grew up among artists. Both his mother and his father were artists. And you see on the left here a portrait of Calder at the age of about 6, painted by his mother, Nanette Lederer Calder. And on the right, jumping forward some 60 years, you have a photograph, a wonderful photograph of Calder taking a nap. Calder loved to take naps. He's a very, very high energy guy. And he'd be very high energy for half the day, and then he'd just kind of zonk out for half an hour, and then he'd wake up and he'd be back in his super duper energy. And here you see him in his house in Roxbury, Connecticut, wonderful farmhouse he shared with his wife Louise and their 2 daughters. And way in the background, in the upper left, you can see hanging this portrait by his mother. Now, not only Calder's mother was an artist, his father was an artist. And in the next photograph image you're going to see on the left, this is Calder's mother and father in Paris in the 1890s. Right after their wedding, Calder's father is this rather elegant young man leaning over the desk, watching his wife write. His name was Alexander Sterling Calder. Our Calder, who everybody called Sandy Calder, was one of a long line of Calders, and he once joked that, "Oh, I'm just the 9th," Alexander Calder. His father was born in Philadelphia, and Calder's father's father was a sculptor too. Many of you have probably been to Philadelphia and even toured Philadelphia City Hall, which is covered with sculpture, all done by our Calder, Sandy Calder's grandfather. Calder's father, as a young man, went to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts to study art, and there he met this interesting young woman, Nanette Lederer, who come from Milwaukee, from a Jewish family in Milwaukee, and they married. And the first thing they did was go off to Paris. And of course, Paris was part of Calder's DNA. And Calder spent time in Paris in the 20s and 30s. And then he and his wife, in their later years in the 60s and 70s, spent much of the year in France. So you begin to see that Calder's DNA, his sensibility, his interests, his view of the world very much comes from his parents. On the right is a wonderful photograph by a friend of Calder's mother, a very well-known photographer by the name of Eva Watson Schutz, of Calder's mother holding the infant, maybe a year or 2 old, Sandy Calder. And Calder's mother was friends with this photographer because they were both feminists. They were feminists who helped organize a women's club for artists, women artists in Philadelphia. And Calder's mother was immensely ambitious an artist, but never really was able to fulfill her dreams as an artist because she subsumed her career into that of her husband, Calder's father. And you see here on the right in the next group of images, an immense fountain that Calder's father made for the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. On the left, you see a sculpture that Calder's father, who's name was Alexander Sterling Calder, made of our Calder, Sandy Calder, when he was about 3, which is called the Man Cub. There's a copy of this sculpture. The sculptures are done in these bronze editions. There's a copy of it in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Calder's father was an immensely well-known sculptor in America in the first quarter of the 20th century. So Calder grew up in artist studios. He and his sister complained that they didn't get paid enough when they modeled for their parents. They said they got 25 cents for a couple of hours. His older sister also had artistic interests. She ended up living in the Bay Area. And you see here in the photograph on the left, the whole family, mother, father, and on the left, Calder, baby age, about 8 or 9, and his sister, when they lived in Pasadena, California. Very, very important for us to understand Calder. You know, people talk about how Calder was born in Philadelphia, but he lived in Philadelphia very briefly. His childhood was really spent in New York and in California. And at the ages of 9, 10, and 11, and this is really key to understanding who Calder is, he was a very creative little boy, and his parents, who were both artists, were very engaged in encouraging and stimulating his creativity. And they were involved in Southern California with what was called the arts and crafts movement. The arts and crafts movement had begun in England, maybe about 50 years, 60 years before the period we're talking about. It was a revolt against, a rebellion against the standardization, depersonalization, and routinization of modern life. And the arts and crafts movement believed that people should make things one-on-one. You shouldn't have a mass-produced chair, you should make a chair. You shouldn't have a mass-produced necklace, you should make a necklace. And little Calder, this boy of 9 or 10 or 11, I have come to believe, was inspired by friends of his parents who were making things by hand. And the 2 small sculptures you see on the right, they're in bent sheet brass, were done by Calder in 1909, either just before they left Pasadena, went back east to New York, or just after. And if you start to kind of think about these sculptures, many ideas that kind of resonate throughout Calder's life kind of begin to emerge. These 2 tiny sculptures were so important to Calder that they were included in his first retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in 1943. And if you then look, and let's move ahead a little bit here, to the world Calder was living in as a boy of 9 or 10, one of the people I believe he knew was the man who did the works, a street sign and a fragment of a metal lamp on the left, a guy named Douglas Donaldson, an arts and crafts metal worker in Southern California, who his parents knew. And I think that Calder, as a boy, this kind of brilliant, creative boy, was imbibing from these friends of his parents these ideas about how the imagination can be kind of expressed if you only let your hands and your whole body move with materials and make things. One of the things I believe Calder saw in California is a doorway. Let's look at this in the next image here. You see on the left, his parents were friends with a man named Charles Loomis, who was very interested in Native American culture in Southern California. And Charles Loomis built a house, and you can see on the door of that house this fascinating ironwork, kind of arabesque. And when I first saw this, I was working on the first volume of my biography, and late at night, I was looking at these images of this house, and I thought, wow. Because if you look at a work of Calder's, like the work on the right, which is it's a napkin clip. Calder loved not just making mobiles, but making practical things. And I thought, wow, in that napkin clip made around 1940, so some 35 years later, there's somehow a memory of this kind of thing. And many ideas from that period around 1900, the arts and crafts movement, you'll see in the next image we're seeing here on the left, this is a watch fob made by a woman in the arts and crafts movement around 1900. Notice the spiral. The spiral is one of these very primal forms. It was Calder's favorite form. He would say, as a man in his 60s and 70s, oh, my favorite form is the spiral. And you see it on the right in many of these pieces of jewelry he made. And throughout his life, he not only made mobiles, but the next slides images you'll see, he made necklaces. A lot of them were gifts for his family, for friends. He also in the late 30s had a couple of shows of jewelry in New York. And then on the right, you see a detail of the kitchen in their house in Roxbury, Connecticut. And many things that Calder made. His wife, Louisa, would say to him, oh, Sandy, you know, I need a big label for that soup we're doing tonight for all those people. And he would go into his workshop, into his studio. By the way, he always called his studio not an artist studio, but a workshop, which was, again, very much an arts and crafts idea. So Louise would say, would you make a ladle? So he would go in and 20 minutes later, he would come out with some wonderful ladle he'd made. So the idea of making, of creating by hand, Calder would never allow his jewelry to be reproduced in editions. Every piece had to be unique. And then when you go from these works to something like the spectacular mobile from 1941, vertical foliage, one of these magnificent, sort of opulent creations, inventions, I think you begin to see how the kind of connection between imagination and the making of things with the hand, the molding of wire, the cutting of pieces of metal to kind of create an echo, an image, a realization of the images in the mind's eye. This was Calder's vocation, and it comes out of this avidity for the making of things that was his birthright, really. And to the end of his life, I mean, at the end of our little session here with Calder, we'll see him creating monumental sculptures, very different from his father's monumental sculptures, but still echoing his father's. And his father had the ambition of making something beautiful for a democratic society, and that was very, very much Calder's ambition as well in his later years. So we're going to jump from his childhood to the late 20s, and I'll just give you a quick kind of summary of what has happened in between what we've just seen and what we're seeing now. Calder at first did not want to go into the family business. His mother, his father were artists. He wanted to do something different. So he went to the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, which many of you I'm sure know, to study engineering. And then he graduated in 1919, and he for 2 or 3 years, he had like this engineering job and that one. He was fired, he left. He could not adjust to being an engineer. And finally, in 1923, he said to his mother, he was living in the Pacific Northwest at that point with his sister. He said, would you send me some paints? And he finally kind of dived into art. He went back to New York. He studied the Art Students League. And in 1926, after studying the Art Students League, after kind of becoming a part of the bohemia of Greenwich Village, with his parents' help, financial help, his parents were always very, very generous with him. He went to Paris. And what you see here in these two images is really a kind of overview of the Parisian Calder. He gets there in 1926, and he begins almost immediately to create the dramatis personae in this a little circus world that he invents. And many of you, I'm sure, have seen the Calder Circus at the Whitney Museum of American Art. The circus began actually as performances done in a tiny hotel room in Paris, maybe for 3 or 4 people at a time. And he started to get known for that. And so that's 1926, 27, 28. By the time that Calder, then married to Louisa, leaves Paris in 1933, he's making these extraordinary, very austere, strange, striking abstract sculptures like the one on the left. In between those years, 2 amazing things happen. And they're really the two, let's go to the portrait of his beautiful wife, Louisa. The 2 things that happen are things with people. And the first thing is, he goes back and forth a lot to America He'll do something in Paris, he'll have a show, and then go back to New York to see what he can do there. And on a boat, the de Grasse, going back to America, he meets this beautiful young woman, a woman in her mid-20s, he's at that point around 30, named Louisa James. Her mother is a Cushing from a very old Massachusetts family. Her father is a James, as in Henry James. Calder's wife is a great niece of the novelist Henry James and the philosopher William James. And you know how, on a boat, a romance can happen very quickly. And by the time they get off this boat in New York, something has happened between them. On the right, you have a wire portrait of Louisa that Calder did shortly after. He did these wire portraits of people he loved. And let's have the next one. And they had a 45-year marriage that was just an amazing marriage. They had in them, to the end of their lives in the 70s, the spirit of the 20s, the time of the Charleston. And here's a wonderful photograph from some years after they're married, where Louisa on the right is playing the accordion. She loved playing the accordion at parties. And on the left, you see Calder dancing. He loved dancing. He was a wild dancer. And when you think about the mobile and his interest in the kinetic, you can really see how that connects with a kind of deep personal desire to move. And by making sculpture move, he was somehow expressing this deep personal urge. The second incredibly important connection he made in Paris is with a man who you see in the next image, the painter Piet Mondrian. And Mondrian, like many Parisian artists, members of the avant-garde, came to these performances that Calder gave the circus. And then sometime later, a few weeks later, Calder went to Mondrian's studio in Paris. Mondrian, the great Dutch painter who lived much of his life in Paris, actually died in New York. Calder was actually in the hospital the morning Mondrian died. They were friends for decades. And he went to Mondrian's studio, and Calder had known about abstract art for many years. He knew people were doing abstract art, but he had never felt abstract art. He'd never felt what it meant to make an abstract painting. And he came to Mondrian's studio, and suddenly he experienced abstract art in this very deep, profound way. And then immediately he starts producing abstract art. I just want to show you briefly, give a brief overview of the Parisian work. The Parisian work begins in 1927, 1928 with these wonderful wire figures. This is a figure of Josephine Baker, the great African-American dancer who was the toast of Paris, and who I think interested Calder for a lot of reasons, partly because of this international spirit, which was so much a part of his life and his wife's life. His wife had actually lived in Paris when he was a kid. Of course, Calder's parents had lived in Paris before he was born. And Josephine Baker was this pure American invention, self-invention, who was a great success in Paris. And the work of the late 20s and up to about 1930, let's look at the next two things, including works such as on the left you see here a work called Brass Family, a magnificent wire figure sculpture from 1930 that's in the Whitney Museum of American Art. These works, these early figure works, which he was in wire, which he was starting to really get pretty well known for around 1930, they have the spirit of the 20s, the kind of champagne high, exuberant optimism of the 20s. And then suddenly, and let's land on this slide for a minute, the Depression hits and everything changes. And Calder sees Mondrian's work, and suddenly he feels he wants to do something very austere and strange, and something that doesn't allude to athletics and dancers and the muscular body, but alludes to a kind of Platonic dream world of pure forms. And here at his first show of abstract work at the Galerie Percier in Paris in 1931, you see these extraordinary abstract works on this long shelf that goes around the gallery. Then actually above you see some of these portraits he had been doing of friends. And you really have here two of the poles of Calder's work, because Calder is always going back and forth. He never really rejects the figure. In many of his later works, there are figurative elements. And then, of course, the last great addition to his repertoire, you might say, in Paris, Paris is, as we see in the next work, some work shown in a show at the Gallery Vignon in Paris in 1932, is his first experiments with mobile, kinetic, moving sculpture. The first mobiles, interesting enough, are like these two on the right. They're driven either by a motor or a crank. And again, they have this very, this kind of startling austerity. Calder and his wife returned in 1933 to America. His wife has had a miscarriage in Paris, which is darkening the world for them. In general, the world of Europe is getting scarier. Hitler is rising in Germany, fascism, the extremes on the right and the left, and they go back to America. And this really ushers in this, what I'm calling, not that this work he did in Paris isn't mature, but what I think we have to think of as the kind of the great last 30-year phase of his career. And you see on the left here, the studio that he builds for himself in Roxbury, Connecticut, where you've already seen some materials of the house, in 1938 to celebrate his 40th birthday. And this really is the kind of the essential Calder studio here in Roxbury. And you see on the right, an ironworks in Tours in France. As his work become larger and larger, although he always worked intimately with every stage of his work, he never left it to anybody else. He began to work both in France, where they lived, the Calders lived a lot in their later years, and in America with these ironworks. So he had this kind of double repertoire. What we think of as the classic mobile, of which your wonderful God mobile is kind of variant, really is kind of defined by around 1940. You see in a wonderful show at the Pierre Matisse Gallery on the left, a group of these works, and then on the right, a work from 19, what is the year of this? 1940, a work called Eucalyptus. And one of the things you notice is the forms are becoming what we'd say more biomorphic. You think of leaf forms, plant forms, tree forms. And I think living as they did, not all the year, sometimes they would be in New York, but they lived a lot of the year in Litchfield County in Connecticut. Calder's work becomes more and more in touch with nature. And also the way the works start to move, they're wind driven, okay? He rarely after this does either motor or crank driven things. There are exceptions, but he wants his work to be a kind of work in a parallel universe, you might say, to the world of nature. And you feel that so very, very strongly in these extraordinary works. Now, one of the things he yearned to do since the 30s, and maybe he yearned to do it since he watched his father do monumental works like the one we saw for the Panama Pacific Exposition, he yearned to do monumental sculpture. But because of the economics of the Depression and then the war years, he only really began to get those opportunities really in the early 60s. And then in the last 2 decades of his life, there's this outburst beginning with the work you're seeing on the left, which is the first of these monumental works, a work of about 60 feet, that's in Spoleto, Italy, which was done for the Festival of Two Worlds in Spoleto, which is about 60 feet high, and is at the right outside the train station, Spoleto. It's almost a kind of modern, wacky, triumphal arch through which you enter the city. And notice what is this thing? Is it an animal? Is it a work of architecture? Calder liked to mix it up. And you feel that also in the work on the right, which is a work done in the 60s, but actually after a design from the 30s, which he did a very small design, a kind of study, and nobody would give him the money to make a big version. But here too, it's like, what are these things? And here we have the absolutely wonderful sculpture that he did in 1969 for Grand Rapids, Michigan, a monumental sculpture. And here you have a kind of art that Calder really, really kind of dived very deep into in these last decades of his life. He had an idea, and some of his friends had an idea from the 30s and 40s. They wanted a new kind of public sculpture that they felt would be public sculpture for a democratic society. And it's interesting in terms of all the recent debates about Confederate sculptures and so on. A very good friend of Calder's named James Johnson Sweeney said in the 40s, you know, a lot of the public sculpture, it's like a man on a horse, or it's Abraham Lincoln sitting in a chair. And it's like, it's only one thing. And when you look at it, you can only think one thing. And he said, in a democratic, open society, you need a kind of art that can let people think and feel freely. And that was what Calder tried to conceive. And this sculpture, La Grande Vitesse, it's called, the great way, the high speed is actually what the French means, that is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's a very interesting story, because even in the late 60s, sculpture like this was very, very controversial. And a lot of people in Grand Rapids, which is a rather conservative city, did not want this thing. They said, what is this weird, wacky thing? We don't want this in the middle of our city near the new city hall, which is that tall building. But over the years, this has become kind of the centerpiece. Almost people feel like it's the soul of Grand Rapids, and it's on many of the official seals and so on of the city. One of the very greatest of these late monumental works is in Chicago. Some of you may have seen it. It's called Flamingo, and it's surrounded by three beautiful, very dark buildings by Mies van der Rohe. You see on the right the ironworks in Connecticut where Calder worked, and in front of the Segret's ironworks in Waterbury, Connecticut, you see a medium-sized study for this monumental sculpture. And again, what is this? Is it a flamingo? Is it an insect? Is it architectural arches? And Calder wanted those flowing meanings. So as you engage with it from many different angles, you would experience different things and feel different things. And I just want to close with a work done 3 years before Calder died called Grand Crinkly, which I think really kind of emphasizes this this kind of wild, crazy openness, the joie de vivre, which you feel in his work. You know, the stable part of this, the base, reminds us of, isn't like a sea animal kind of, you know, a seal balancing something on its nose almost, yet it isn't really that. And then it combines, as he did in many of the later works, a stable, a non-mobile element, and then on top of it a mobile, and then this crazy color. What is it? Okay, and it's like, it's this kind of joyous, crazy enigma that seems to have come out of the kind of wild recesses of the imagination and then been realized in the world. And I think that is the promise that Calder's parents really wanted for him at you know, when he was a boy. I mean, in the end, I think he was still that kid in Pasadena playing with pieces of sheet brass. Thank you. Thank you very much.